Can you hear me? Yes, well, welcome everyone. It's great to see so much interest in today's topic, multilateral reform and the role of African countries. I am Beatriz Avellan. I'm policy analyst at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and I will be moderating this excellent panel today. So multilateralism is a key topic for us at FEPS, and we are very happy to bring it here to the main stage in Africa Day. So before going on the topic, I would like to introduce you to this amazing panelists we have for today. So we have Paul Okumu. He's the head of Secretariat for the Africa Platform, an organization working across Africa in 23 countries, which objective is to rebuild the social contract and ensure African resources are used for Africa's development. He has also played a significant role in various initiatives, including shaping major international policy frameworks as the UN Landmine Ban, the 2015 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the 2011 New Deal for Engagement with Fragile and Conflict States. We have also with us today Anna Pot. She's the National Coordinator of UN Sustainable Development Goals for the government of the Netherlands. Previously, she was an asset manager for pension funds. She has helped develop sustainable policy practices for businesses around the world and improve the responsibility. And then we also have with us David Luke. He's a professor at the London School of Economics. He's director at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa, specializing in African trade and trade negotiation. He's also the former director of the African Trade Policy Center at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And then last but not least, we have with us Benedita Aloaquinu. She's the president of the Foundation des Jeunes Amazones pour le Développement, and she's also the creator of the civic tech project Let El. And she's also a committed feminist, lawyer, and activist from Benin. So as you know, we have these amazing panelists. We were supposed to have with us as well Florence Siebo, but unfortunately, due to problems with her visa, she was not able to come. And so that also shows the issues with the current migration system we have. So, very quickly about today's session. So this wants to be a very interactive session. We're going to have Q&A at the end. So please start thinking and reflecting about different questions that you might ask the panelists. And for the panelists as well, I want you to invite to maybe interact whenever you feel you would like to contribute, so we can have kind of a lively conversation, but also to be a bit mindful with time. This panel is only 1 hour with Q&A, so as well, I will ask you to be like straight and to the point and short. So why multilateralism? We think right now we're in a key moment to rethink financial institutions and financial governance systems. We saw last September in the UN that was adopted the Pact for the Future. This pact was a landmark achievement. There were issues such as sustainable development, peace and security, digital governance, and other topics that were included in this pact. However, we are in a world where we see like 59 active armed conflicts around the world. We see that we are lagging behind the 2030 agenda. At the current pace, only 17% of the targets will be achieved by 2030. So we really need to accelerate the efforts to really implement the 2030 agenda. And especially when it comes to African countries, we are seeing how they have so many issues related to debt with funding climate action. So this panel tries to kind of look for hope in this situation and how we can make sure that we reform the multilateral institutions so they can really be fit for purpose and deliver for all and not for a few. So my first question actually is for two of our panelists, Anna and Okumu. So is there space for optimism? Is this the right time for momentum to reform the multilateral system, and why?
Yes. Yeah, well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me here, fresh in this new role. Only started 2 months ago, so yeah, need to get a bit in the hang of it. But it's such an honor to work on this so important topic and lead our work on the Sustainable Development Goals in the Netherlands and for the Netherlands. So on your point about the pact, I think for me what it does is it helped to generate momentum again. And that is so hardly needed. If I see there is, also in the Netherlands, among members of parliament, among government, there seems to be somewhat of a fatigue on the sustainable development goals. I also see that among companies, they're looking for a next, thing to hang on to. But also among investors. My previous job, I worked in the financial sector and worked with asset owners on investing pension funds in a sustainable world. I also see among the asset management industry this ESG backlash enormously, impacting the momentum. And don't need to tell anyone here, but we don't have any choice. We don't have a choice. We just really need to act on it. And as you mentioned, we've only met like 70% of the goals. That's just not acceptable. So for me, that momentum that this pact creates is so hardly needed, and also it gives me hope again, and gives me inspiration to work together. In one of my first weeks, I was happy to attend a big conference in Hamburg Sustainability Conference. And when I was there, it was so good to see how the follow-up on the pact was taking place. And because yes, it's nice that we have that momentum in the UN in New York, but it's really about this follow-up actions that need to be done. And when I was in Hamburg and listening to the people speaking there, there was this sense of urgency, but also sense of action. And it became clear that many leaders from Africa, many members of government representatives, but also companies, investors, NGOs, civil society groups were there to work. It was set as this is a working group. This is not a conference; it's a working group, and it's the first working group of the range of working groups that we're going to have after this, the Financing for Development Summit, the Social Summit, and the next ones. And for me, that's what the pact does to me. It is a wake-up call. We need to act now. We need to work together, and we are doing it. I'll leave it here.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I wish I would be equal. I would be as optimistic as she is, but
after an hour, you will.
Because there is a phrase we normally have that your actions are so loud they can hardly hear your words. And for me, what I'm asking myself is, between 1994, as a young I was just about entering university. That maybe gives an idea about my age. And we were running this campaign that we didn't understand for the anti-personnel, whatever, for the banning of landmines. And as young students, we were very excited, and we didn't understand, and we didn't have the tools. And we got shocked when, in a period of just about 3 years, we managed to get 157 countries to stop banning, to stop the use of the landmines. I was even much more surprised when in 1997 we were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, because I think even people didn't understand, they didn't believe that things could happen like that. And that, for me as a young boy, that gave me a momentum that when countries come together, they can actually do things. But we have moved in a span of just about 30 years to a place where I was in a meeting last month. I sit on the advisory board of the Global Gateway, and you can see there is absolutely no interest whatsoever by governments to attempt to bring any kind of change. We have entered into individual contracts where we bring some politicians and we have contracts with them. And I'm just wondering, so what has shifted so much between 1993 and 2024? That's in a span of about 30 years. And allow me to just mention 3 things that I think have shifted that maybe we need to understand. First of all is multilateralism used to work until it stopped working. And why did it stop working? Is because we increasingly became much more self-centered, we increasingly started looking for power for ourselves. And our public, I'm talking about the citizens in countries such as Europe, and as you can see, the United States, have now become much more assertive in terms of their capitalism demands, and that is forcing governments to increasingly isolate themselves from discussions that are collective to discussions that are self-serving to citizens. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I'm noticing is, while there's a lot of excitement about the pact for the future, I think a bit of memory tells us that actually this is not the first pact. We had the Millennium Declaration, which was under Kofi Annan. And then when Ban Ki-moon came, he came with realizing the future we want, which was his own idea of a pact. And then now we have got this other pact. So I don't think there's anything new in the pact, because the Millennium Declaration was mutilated. If you look at the document itself, it's a very good document. But what did the member states do with it? They mutilated it, and they gave us the MDGs. Very, very simplistic goals. Then realizing the future we want, which came out of the Rio +20, was a very huge document that looked at the sustainability from the much bigger danger. And I was part of the people that was involved with it. It expanded it a little, but what did we also do? We have just taken one paragraph, which I think is paragraph 92, if I'm not wrong, that speaks about Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and that's what we're talking about. We are not talking about the full pact. And my worry is we are now taking the pact for the future, and maybe in about 10, 15 years, we'll again mutilate it into something small. So while I agree that the pact has momentum, my concern is what kind of momentum. I don't know how many of us in 2015 were in Addis Ababa when we were having the forum for whatever the financing for development discussion. I was involved very deeply in that discussion because we had our problems with what had informed it, which was the Washington consensus. And so we thought that in going to Addis, we would have something much better. But what did our European friends did? They picked 21 countries that were suffering on the African continent, struck a private deal with them, and when we got to Addis Ababa, they teamed up with those 21 countries to completely reorganize the entire document. The discussions we had about tax, which was supposed to be part of FFD, discussions, was removed and given back to the OECD. The discussion about corporate power was removed and given back to the World Bank. In fact, the financing for development discussion was supposed to be part of the 2030 agenda. But the same countries that now appear to be excited about the path for the future are the ones who teamed up and ensured that it was removed from the Agenda 2030 discussion and given to who? Given to the World Bank. So I am not very sure that I wish I was as positive, but looking at the trend, the actions are very loud. I don't care so much about the words.
Well, maybe now we can reflect a bit deeper on the international governance architecture. So as we know, like the UN, the Bretton Woods agreements were created in many years ago before the decolonization wave. And we see, for example, there is no representation of African countries in the UN Security Council. So my question actually to David is, are these institutions fit for purpose? Like, can adapt to today's challenges, given like the current deficits when it comes to democracy, the representation of African countries and other development countries as well? And how can we maybe adapt them to today's world?
Great. Firstly, good questions, Beatrice. But first, thanks to the Max van Stuel Foundation and FEPS for sponsoring this event. I think the traditional answer that you would expect me to give to this question is that yes, today's world is very different from what it was in 1945 when the Bretton Woods institutions were set up, the UN itself, and the way that power was distributed within these organizations and so on. So I think you've all heard this many, many times before, so I'm not going to go in that direction. I think we can all agree. We can also all agree that yes, indeed, the SDGs and long, and thanks, Paul, for giving us that background, and that sort of long trajectory to identifying goals and targets and so on. All that has been, in some ways, useful and helpful in trying to focus attention. But I have to say that I fully agree with Paul when he asks the question, what kind of momentum? And my own view is that we are asking the wrong questions. Let me just give you some figures, and then let's discuss these figures. The biggest source of foreign exchange or capital into Africa is trade. And that brings about 500 billion a year, okay? Almost half a trillion, 500 billion. The next one is remittances. That is the African diaspora in all these in all these countries, in Europe, in North America, everywhere. That brings 84 billion. Just look at the gap between the 500 billion and the 84 billion. The next one is foreign direct investment, which brings about 40 billion, almost half what remittances bring. And then the last one is, and these are annual figures, the last one is foreign aid, including loans. That brings about 35 billion. Now, where would you put your energy and effort? Which one of these categories I've given you? Anyone? Where would you put your energy and effort if you have this kind of distribution? Instead of me answering the question, maybe the audience can answer that question. Where would you put your energy and effort? Anyone? Don't be shy. Sorry?
Youth.
Youth?
Youth.
Youth.
Youngsters. Yeah.
Well, yeah, youngsters, yeah, you put your effort on the youngsters because their future is where the highest proportion of what comes into the African continent is, and that's trade. So I think that we have underestimated the power of trade. And I'm not saying anything new. We've not discovered anything new in my own research. And by the way, I refer you, there's not going to be time to get into this. I refer you to my book, How Africa Trades. It's published by London School of Economics Press. Came out in 2023. It's free. It's open access publication. So you just go to the internet, look for my name, and download the book. So, basically, I think we're putting our effort in the wrong place because trade has always been the source of wealth everywhere. Take this country we're sitting in. What has transformed this country is trade everywhere, so it's not anything new. And if you have a healthy trading system, everything else will fall into place. The SDGs, the health, the education, the youth, yes, the provision for the youth, all that will fall into place. And so, I've been, in my own research, I've been really frustrated that African governments, development partners are not really putting the emphasis where they should put it in. I have brought with me some copies of this, I don't know what to call it, but a summary of actually the arguments in how Africa trades. And it's a new trade deal for Africa, please. There are about 12 copies outside. And anyone could pick this one up because I don't need to take it back with me. But it was just to show you. I think that we need to put our emphasis on trade. Mm-hmm. We need to look at the trade deals between Africa and Europe because Europe remains Africa's biggest single partner. For individual countries, yes, China is now a major trading partner, but collectively, Europe is still. And I think that the deal that Africa has with Europe is not the right deal, and I give all the reasons here and in the book as well. And let me end with one other scandalous view. We don't talk about hunger in Africa. 20% of the African population is undernourished or malnourished. 25% of the population faces food insecurity. My next book, which is coming out next year, is How Africa Eats. It's a follow-up to How Africa Trades. And we break down again these figures and the scandalous aspects of hunger in Africa. So I think that, yes, Beatrice, the institutions are not fit for purpose, but we need to be asking ourselves the right question. And also when it comes to food, the way that we trade in food, the subsidies and all that, this incentivizes agricultural production in African countries. That is the reason for the hunger. So we need to look at these trade relationships, not just focus on the distribution of power and within the international organizations, the multilateral system and so on. That will take care of itself if you have a strong and prosperous Africa. It will be assertive, just like every other area that is emerging. Emerging economies are becoming assertive. I think we need to go back to trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor David. So now we have mentioned the youth. So, and we talk about the role of African countries, how we can make sure that this system is equitable, but then also looking at the voice of these African countries, how can we make sure that this participation is meaningful, but also inclusive? So how we make sure that also the voices of young people, of ethnic minorities, displaced populations, women, are also within this conversation. And I think Benedita will be the right person to answer to this question.
Thank you, Bea. Hello, everyone. My name is Benedita, and I feel honored to be here. In advance, I want to apologize for any imperfection in my English language. Being here despite this language challenge is powerful, reflect that inclusion we work towards. So I deeply recommend this effort. So how can we ensure that a greater representation for African countries, and how can we make sure that this voice include women, young, displaced people, refugees, and ethnic minorities? It is a big question, and I want to remember that global governance systems were created in a moment during a time when Africa was not equality represented. So today we must correct this, we must recognize this historical injustice and assure fair and justice representation and meaningful inclusion for African countries. So I think that we can achieve this by 3 actions. The first is permanent and fair representation of African countries. And to do this, we can firstly introduce criteria, fair criteria that prioritize country promoting peace, equality, and inclusion. We can also promote African country participation in the with the veto power. It's very important because to take a decision, African country is not represent. So ensure African country can participate equally with veto power as part of future vision. And I think that we must highlight countries that actively involve women and young in decision maker. Secondly, I think that we must actively include marginalized voice in decision making, not as a consultant, not as a counselor. Directly involve them, involve grassroots organizations and feminist organizations, not just as advisor, but as decision maker. Create platform to ensure the consent and include our global forum, especially during universal evaluation. And I think that we must bring in diverse perspective forum women, young, LGBTQ people, and ethnic minority. We must participate in this forum. And to finish, I want to say that the third action is ensure linguistic justice. It's very important. It's important because we must allow representatives to freely speak to their native language in our conversation, in our space. It's important to have a full translation support. And I finish And I say that integrated to the part of future into this reform will ensure a more inclusion and sustainable global governance system. But it's important to African voice, to woman voice, that we be the place, we be in the place and talk for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these strong words. Okumu?
I think listening to her, and I wish I could be excited, because there's this world that we want where the Africa is represented in the Security Council and is represented in all decision-making places. And Africa recently was requested to join the G20 as a permanent member. And I wondered whether Africa is a country, because there is no way. Because already South Africa is in the G20 as a country. We don't have a country called South Africa, called Africa. And the African Union is not structured the way the European Union is structured for it to even have any representation. Right now, there is a fight on who even speaks on behalf of the continent. But allow me to mention two things that have happened in the world over the last number of years, and I hope it will be captured in the book of How Africa Is. But I encourage you to read Africa Trades. I read it, How Africa Trades, and it forced me to actually write a book similar to that. It's not called Africa Trades, but I've looked at the trade issues. It's coming out on the 1st of December. On the one end, we have got self-serving governments that are emerging. These are governments that believe that the primary interest is to serve certain individuals, most often very extremely capitalism individuals. So if you look at the United States is becoming a self-serving. It has a very, very strongly self-serving. You look at Italy is becoming very self-serving. And you have got those. So it doesn't necessarily serve the citizens or the society. It actually serves a particular section of the society, but masquerades as serving the society. So we have got those government on the one extreme end. Then on the other extreme end, we have got government serving society. Now, ideally, that used to be nice. And Europeans used to love governments that serve society. But now, it is how they define society. So society is now become ourselves. So there are a group of people who decide that we are the society and therefore things should serve us. I had a very honest discussion with somebody at the European Commission that I will not mention. And in the midst of a very heated discussion about issues around trade and issues around how Africa, how the EU, for example, gives 70 billion euros in so-called aid to the continent, but they take away 470 billion out of the trade arrangement. And the person gave me a very interesting statement. Told me, you know what? Our population of 500 million Europeans, or the EU member states, are interested in particular goods delivered in particular ways, served under particular conditions to fulfill a particular purpose. Our role in the European Commission is to provide it for them. So if you have got a problem with that, then you go and change our citizens' demands. So the biggest challenge we have right now are the citizens seated here who have decided to define society as them. And we no longer see society as the global citizenry of what it used to be. And that, for me, I think is the biggest challenge, even while we are talking very well about multilateralism. It is no longer so much that it is governments that are pushing particular things. It's that we are redefining governments. And the governments are either serving a particular section of society or serving what we ourselves are defining as society.
Thank you very much, Okumu, for this thoughtful reflection. And I think that maybe we can link that with the next set of questions, looking at the future, so looking ahead. So we know that you already mentioned next year there's going to be the fourth Funding for Development Forum taking place in Spain. There will also be the UN Global Social Summit in Qatar. So there are these two key opportunities when it comes to this topic. So how can we make sure that we really take this opportunity to advance the 2030 agenda, to advance this multilateral reform and implementation, the put into practice of the Pact for the Future? So what are the key actions we should propose in this forum? I would like, Anna, maybe if you...
Yeah, and maybe you're building upon what's been said before, because, yes, it's not, we don't live in isolation. And I think the point that you made in terms of what are the big levers, trade, it shows that the world is connected. And as we are sitting here, we're connected with other places in the world, despite our discussions that we have, and governments that that need to serve the people in our country. The world is larger than just where we are. So the point about interconnectedness, I very much support it, and that's where also we need to generate the action. Following on your point, trade, that's a big lever. So let's make sure that trade works. So if we unpack that, what does it mean? It means the players that are playing on that playground at the trade is the companies that are doing businesses. So how do we make sure that these companies do business in a sustainable and responsible way in the long term? So not only now, but also for the youngsters and the future generations. And that means that we need to be very critical and be very clear on these companies to hold them to account. Hold them to account to make sure that also in Africa, they play by the rules. There are rules. We don't need to invent new initiatives and new standards. If we look, for instance, to the cocoa supply chain and child labor in the cocoa farms still taking place as of today, when did we say child labor was allowed in certain parts of the world? No, we have been very clear about it. That is a standard, that's a rule that exists. And there is countries with governments who have set regulation and enforcement mechanisms that also applies to these companies, these foreign companies that come in there and take part in that trade, take part in that playground. They need to make sure that they apply by the rules and play by the rules. And therefore, I think for me that's such an example that I can't get my hand around. How is that still possible that companies feel they can get away with that? So I think for me that's the first part. Also on your point, it's us, right? It's also the consumers here. We need to make sure that we hold companies to account that they operate by the rules, that they operate in a responsible and sustainable manner, and are held to account for that. I think the second point, and I think I was inspired by what you said about the role of women, and I think there's enough academic research about it that women play such an important role in development, and I think that's another lever where we have. How can we how can we accelerate that? How can we benefit from that? And I was pleased to read when I was preparing for this panel about the role that the Netherlands is playing in terms of providing assistance and being a partner for the African development banks and different projects that the Netherlands is supporting. And one of that is about providing loans and insurance to female entrepreneurs in Africa. I think those are, for me, the sparks of hope that we need to have. That's where we need to, push for and find those levers to help and generate a development that works, and that works in a sustainable and long-term way for our youngsters, but also for our future generations.
Thank you very much, Anna. David?
Yeah, I guess one has to ask the question, who sets the goals and what rules are we talking about? I think it's very important, of course, for companies to aim much higher and in regard to trading in a sustainable and responsive way. But then when you look at the rules and the incentives and so on, it actually boxes the companies, including African SMEs, which are most companies into trading in a way that is disadvantageous to them. You know, that is, as we know, long history of commodity trading and extractives and so on. If you look at the WTO today, of course, it's not functioning. And the reason why it's not functioning anymore is because the most powerful nation decided that it would scrap the appellate body, and so the WTO no longer has an appellate body. But I talked about the WTO agricultural rules, which for a continent like Africa, agriculture is the most important sector for its future development. And those rules are not in Africa's favor. Let me also just give one example. This was actually something just this week, a case that I said to my class at the London School of Economics. Right now, there is South Africa and the EU, South Africa and the EU have a case at the WTO on the EU's banning of imports of citrus fruit from South Africa. And the reason for banning those fruit imports is that there is a disease called black spot citrus, which South African oranges are susceptible to. South Africa is the second largest exporter of citrus fruits. Spain is the first. And this fruit, this disease actually disfigures the fruit, the outside of the fruit, but not the inside. Which means that the fruit can still be used for like frozen orange juice or concentrates for various things. South Africa tried to get the EU to negotiate that they would subject the fruit to a certain temperature. I think when it's sort of not quite frozen, but very cold temperatures, it actually does. I think it changes the effect of this. The fungus on the fruit or something. The EU refused that, and it's under its rights, under sanitary phytosanitary rules, to say no, and then the case is at the WTO. But for South Africa, $116 million is at stake in the banning of these exports. And then, of course, somebody talked about the youth, their jobs and all that. The South African economy is not exactly robust. So, these are the ways that, my class concluded that this case could easily have been solved with the EU finding this new scientific method of subjecting the fruit to this lower temperature or whatever before it is exported, that it could have been solved, but the EU has refused to do that. And the suspicion is that the EU wants to protect Spain and the Spanish producers and other Mediterranean producers of citrus. So, Anna, the rules are important, but how the rules are being applied is unfair in this world when it comes to trade. And look, DG Trade is the most powerful negotiating trade instrument on this planet. You see what they did to the UK on the Brexit. They wiped them on the floor. They're very good at what they do. Paul, I think you would agree with that. And that's exactly what they've done to Africa. They have boxed Africa into this economic partnership agreement, which Africa is not ready for. It's explained in here. And, basically, we can talk about the SDGs for the next 50 years. It's not going to change the structure of African economies. I think this is what we should be aiming at. Sorry, I've got too long.
That's good. I
think I want us to remember some three figures. So if you can write this down, that is $19.7 trillion, 87%, and 470 billion. And maybe if you want to add, we've been given another 500 billion. And you'll understand why holding a meeting in Qatar or taking it to Spain will not change anything. In 2020, we did a study to understand how governments were coping in response to COVID, and particularly looking at how much money was being made available to the citizens. And collectively, we were shocked that while everybody's saying we need 3 trillion every year for us to achieve the SDGs, and we don't have it. In a span of 90 days, governments were able to raise $19.7 trillion. That's trillion with a T, dollars, in 90 days. People such as the EU and the US literally printed money, if you look at how they did it. And one of the interesting things is that the amount of money that the World Bank and the IMF allowed Africa to raise was an equivalent to what Australia gave as an assistance to mental health of their own citizens, 35 billion. So an equivalent amount given for mental assistance, a very small section of the citizens' was the equivalent of the total amount that the continent was allowed under the rules, the financial rules that have been set. You then begin to see the struggle that the continent has every day when it is attempting to just feed itself. If the amount of money that 55 countries can raise for COVID response is equivalent to what the US government gave to write off the support that was given as school fees, whatever, as fees to university students. So it tells you a lot. What is the 87%? I sat in the advisory board of the World Economic Forum responsible for Africa. Please don't ask me how I ended up there for that. But in the process of struggling to find how African companies can engage much more, we were then tasked with finding out which companies had done particular turnovers, and to our surprise, we found 87% of companies that have got a turnover of 10 million euros. 10, that's 10. Companies that have got a turnover more than that are not owned by Africans. So typically, Africa is a European plantation. We are a plantation for the Europeans. And that tells you what amount of struggle that we have. What is the 470 billion? It is what I mentioned. It makes no sense for us, especially in the NGO sector, to keep on harping and talking about 35 billion that we have just been taught, while we are losing 470 billion every year through the corporations that feed you. So you guys are taking our 470 billion, and then you sit in conferences to tell us how we need 35. It just doesn't make sense at all. I mean, even a kindergarten kid, if you gave them 450 shillings, whatever, euros, whatever, forget about the billions, and you made an argument, the argument will not be like that. But let me conclude. How does that happen? I hear a lot of conversations around companies, and how companies need to pay their taxes, need to be over that. But it's not as straightforward as that. Every single European company that works on the African continent is preceded by an agreement made by European governments. They don't make rules on their own. Even the NGO staff seated here, how you get your salary is an agreement made between your government and my government. Your government insists that your salary cannot be paid in Africa. It is paid to you here. So your 4,000 euros doesn't go there, it comes here. And so when we are talking about companies need to, in Feb, I was involved in the process leading to the Addis Ababa, whatever process, and at some point, the African governments were assisted by, I know you don't like this very much, China. When the negotiations got very difficult, because Europe, Australia, and the United States insisted that they were not going to discuss issues of trade, they were not going to discuss issues of taxes, they were not going to discuss issues of how Africa loses money. It is China that stood up behind Africa
And we now had a group called G77 plus China, G77 plus China. And initially when I was in New York, I used to get upset. Why are they adding China? I mean, why not say G78 then? Why say G77 plus China? But I realized they were trying to communicate to you guys that for the last 77 years, you have talked and talked, but in your action, you are sinking us deeper and deeper and deeper. And so when we find somebody who is willing to at least listen, however weak it is, we will turn to that person. And that's what, unfortunately, we see happening now.
Thank you very much, Paul. So we have been looking at the bigger picture with the big companies, with the governments, but I would like to also look at the local organizations. And we have mentioned the Funding for Development Forum next year, and I would like to go back to this issue of inclusivity. It's like we know that less than 1% of the ODA directed towards gender equality goes to feminist organizations, women's rights organizations, and local organizations. And my question would be, how do we make sure that looking forward, these local feminist organizations, women's rights, are well funded and their voices, because at the end of the day, if they have no funding, they have no place for action. So how do we make sure that we propose the right action to this to achieve?
Thank you, Bia. I'm feminist, and I'm working in a feminist local organization. My organization is based on north of Benin, in my country. So for my experience, I think that is a big question, and we must address systemic barriers. I think that we must reborn the architectural of financement. And to do this, I think that today we must create accessible mechanisms who permit to a girl to my country, in my community, to participate in the forum, in the espace, which we can talk about our problem. We can address the systemic barriers, address the reality, and simplify funding application and remove bureaucratic obstacles, because we have also very much bureaucratic obstacle in the process to access to a financement. So smaller feminist and local organizations can access resources if we simplify them. I think that today, a girl, where is my country, where is in my community, is a very big challenge to participate to this summit, summit of future, part of future summit, or summit of financement. So I think that today we must address this challenge and cover travel, visas, accommodation for young activists, for women, for girls who want to participate to this forum, to this summit, and ensure fair participation. And align funding with our realities, align funding with real needs of local organizations, of feminist organizations. We must build, I think, collaboration that allow local organizations to grow, to sustain, and to impact. Use the forum, the summit, not just as speeching, not just take picture. Yes, it's good, but we need to mobilize. We need to mobilize, and this forum is the space that we can mobilize significant resources for our organization, for organizational growth and community projects. And the financing for development forum is an opportunity. I think that we can rethink financial system and tackle global inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benedita. Now we will open the floor for questions. So I have my colleague here who would have the mic. So please, I see two over here, there. So let's take a couple of questions and then we'll let the speakers to respond.
Hi, my name is Eugene from Ghana, and I study in Wageningen. So my question is directed to Paul. Earlier, you talked about the disparity in terms of the voices or maybe the representation that you are likely to find in spaces like this, as against the voices of our leaders and what their aspirations are. So my question is, what can we do to ensure that we have a really common and unifying aspiration for the continent and how we should develop? And now I'm also interested in finding out if the people who represent us in some of these forums really have the competencies to speak on our behalf, and what do they really go in to ask for? I mean, because there's this common joke sometimes when we meet as students, you walk through a space where there's a conversation going on. People are making presentations on Uganda, Kenya, and then you look through the rooms, you don't see faces that look like people who come from those places, but then they are making presentations about the continent. And then their findings and recommendations are likely to be the driving force for the things that need to happen on the continent. So who are the people representing us, and are they really competent? Do they speak on our behalf? And do they know that sometimes they may be bullied by just some interns or masters just speaking on behalf of their government here, and then our people are not able to match up? So if you can respond to this, thank you.
Maybe let's get two more.
You could choose which one.
Also one over there, and
It's only 2 minutes.
As a student of Africa Studies in Leiden, I'm very interested in what we all talked about, and I really like the previous question. I would like to ask more from like a European perspective, I guess. How can we take concrete steps to make this world more equal, and how to make trade more equal? You're talking about Africa as a plantation of Europe. I think that's unacceptable. So how are we going to change that?
thank you. And then I see a hand over there as well.
Yes. My question is towards Paul and David, and it's about trading in Africa. Within Africa, we see like within Africa, there are so many borders, and it's very hard to trade within, like even within one country, there are borders, unnecessary taxes, currency differences, and even it's like to travel from one region to another, there is always a police. Nobody knows what they are guarding, searching people like pockets, and asking you, where are you going? And you are even within a country. So apart from European trade and other trading with other continents, can we talk a little bit about like how can we improve the trading within Africa and remove like all these obstacles and these challenges within regions? Yeah,
Thank you very much. Then now I'll ask, please, the speaker to be short, straight to the point, and please.
I think I'll just, let me push the difficult question to the academic, because he will probably be able to be much more effective in answering them. For me, I'll talk about three things very quickly. When I'm not making noise about activism, I work on the social contract. And one of the biggest challenges that we face in the 23 countries where we worked is that we have got very tiny little ethnic groups that are masquerading as democracies. And then those of us in the NGO sector confuse elections with democracy. And so we have got a system where we have allowed countries that were gobbled together by the colonizers. Several ethnic groups, I think Nigeria has got 127 plus, and have gobbled together. But because we rely on a process called elections, it means that one or two ethnic groups can actually, by virtue of a ballot, control everything else that happens in that country. And so for me, the whole issue that we need to ask ourselves in this room is how to rethink the social contract in a way that there is much more bigger voice. Secondly is, I think those of us in the development sector, please let's leave this language of our partners. It makes no sense. Every time I hear the language about partners, I get very offended. Because the reason why it offends me is that what you are calling your partner is actually somebody who is a subcontractor on your behalf. Cited somewhere. A study that was done in 2015 showed that 97%, please, another statistics, 97% of the entire development funding that is given goes to INGOs. Only 3% ends up with the so-called partners. And so while we are accusing the governments, we also have to ask ourselves, what is 97% of the funding doing here in The Hague, in Amsterdam, in Copenhagen, while we are saying that we are working on the African continent? So we ourselves also need to ask how we redefine that. I think the first thing that I want to make is very interesting, the question that you've raised. If you go to my LinkedIn, I wrote a small little article about my journey, which I took over the weekend, from Kenya to Uganda by road, you know, and what happened across the border. I have been shocked at the response that has come out of that article, not by other people, by the Africans themselves, of how they are experiencing similar struggles, just crossing an imaginary line drafted by some colonizer that this is now Kenya, so you are now entering Uganda. And remember that. It is extremely, it sounded hilarious, but it was extremely tragic. And for me, I think that the solution to that goes back to what I would want to call you guys to do. Let's come and reorganize the social contract on the African continent. There is a TED talk that was given by a Zambian, I think so. It's called Becky Nkosi Moyo, Dr. Becky Nkosi Moyo, about the kind of individuals that our African governments bring as ambassadors to the EU and to Europe. And the biggest challenge is we bring political failures and political rejects to be the one to represent us in diplomatic engagements. And no wonder we are able to lose so much because of that. So for me, the solution lies in three things. One, let's reorganize the social contract. Number two, let's challenge our own governments, for you guys who are in Europe, to think much more broadly around society than just about ourselves. And then number three is, let us see how we can reorganize the power games in ways that we are able to say we cannot be feeding for almost 500 years out of a plantation that we call Africa. I have fully agree with, and there's a time I wrote, I think it was 2 weeks ago, when the European Foreign Affairs Minister, the EU Foreign Affairs Minister, talked about Europe being a garden. And I said, it is actually true that Europe is a garden, but you are a very expensive garden. Extremely expensive, because you are existing at the cost of a jungle that you have refused to even take care of. You simply just go to the jungle to get your food and to come and use it to tend your garden. I think it is time that we reorganized how we relate between the two of us.
Thank you very much.
I'll try to be brief. I know we don't have much time. The lady who is a student at Leiden asks what are the concrete steps that could be taken to make the trade rules more equal. There isn't going to be time to get into this, but if you go to my book, How Africa Trades, the last chapter, the concluding chapter, I spell out the sorts of reforms that are needed globally with trading partners like China, the EU. By the way, we focus a lot on the EU. China has no concrete trade policy framework with the African countries, which is unconscionable, and there's no time to go into this. Also say things like the EU has its trade regimes with the African countries. This disincentivizes their efforts to trade among themselves. The EU has the EPA with Kenya, just to give one example, but then with Tanzania, Uganda, and the rest of the East African community, they have everything but arms. So the regulatory alignment is not there. Just like the EU refused that Northern Ireland has to remain within the EU in terms of, after Brexit, for trading, That's exactly what the EU has done to East Africa. So, these are the sorts of reforms that will change the way that trade happens. And the gentleman who talked about the trade, the borders, the points that Paul also responded to. Yes, these non-tariff barriers are very important, and these reforms, and also in my own work, in my own research, I call this out, that we need these reforms. There is a big effort, this African Continental Free Trade Area, to open up trade among the African countries, including border reforms. And by the way, I also sit on the board of Trademark Africa, which works on trade facilitation and so on. But the point is that within Africa, there's a lot of work to do. With Africa and its partners, there's also a lot of work to do. Benedicta raised these issues about gender equality and so on. One of the worst occurrences of inequality is to go look at the border, what happens at the border, how women traders are harassed, not to mention people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, etc., trying to get across borders and so on. So we have all these issues that we also have to deal with within Africa, across borders, people trying to cross borders for trade, for whatever reason, and so on. Actually, it's just as difficult for Africans to move across borders. And movement of people has to be associated with trade. You cannot have one or the other. So it's also very difficult for Africans to move across borders for all of these reasons: gender reasons, disability reasons, LGBTQ reasons, etc. So we need to deal with all of these issues internally as well as externally. Let me just end with this point. I don't think Paul and I and some of the things that have been said is to make anyone guilty about anything. I think what we're trying to do is to challenge everyone to think beyond these paradigms that are out there on development, on the SDGs and so on, for all of us to realize that we all need to do more. And I think that's the value of spending a Saturday morning in a conference such as this.
And I can echo that if you want me to briefly close. So yes, it is about acting upon the challenge, and is to be optimistic and act on this optimism. So what is it that we can do? We can work for companies that are innovating and are operating in a responsible way and are doing trade in a meaningful way that works. So go and work for a company and speak up and make sure that these companies are going to innovate in a good way. Then there is ways that what you can do in terms of your own consumption patterns. There's so much we can do. I don't need to tell that here. But also, if you work, then you generate pensions. Call your pension fund to account and ask for that transparency and make sure that these investments are done in a good way, that work and are listened to what is actually needed in your supply chain. And then, of course, we're the lucky ones who live in a democracy. So make sure you vote.
Thank you very much. And then maybe, Benedicta, if you have any closing remarks, and then we'll have to close the panel. Unfortunately, we have no more time for questions, but the speakers will be here a little bit more. So if you have any other question, please don't hesitate.
I want to greet you. I want to greet for the invitation, and I want to say that all challenge is big. It's a big challenge, but I think that now is good that we talk about. We are an African, and we are here. We are talking about is a good thing, and I think that women, young, minority ethnic, and women in area can be represented to the forum, the summit, and talk about our preoccupation, and we can ensure that African voice, African woman voice, African youth voice is greater representation and is in the place. Thank you for the invitation, and so sorry, being with me. My English is a challenge, but it's good.
Fantastic.
To be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and hope to see you next year here at Africa Day again. Thank you.